this is technically the term for an economy like this is fascism or corporatism. And that's what we had during the war. In World War I, when something similar had happened, but not nearly on the same scale, people talked about war socialism. That was the term they used then. In World War II, they never gave this setup a name. They just acted as if, oh, it's just, business is good now because the government's become such a massive buyer for all these things. But it was only a buyer for things it wanted to buy, decided how much to pay for, and told you to produce. And if you didn't produce, it would nationalize your damn firm. It did that repeatedly. And in fact, on some occasions, almost all of them connected with labor disturbances, union management disputes that were threatening to shut down the industry, the government took over the whole industry. In World War II, it took over the bituminous coal industry, which was very, very important in those days, twice. It took over the whole railroad industry, which was very, very important, more than once. It took over the meatpacking industry and a bunch of others. And it didn't have to take over a whole industry, it could just take over a particular firm. And it did that on hundreds of occasions. So this is not a free market economy, that's my point. And if you're interpreting it and trying to understand it in terms of the usual way that we try to understand the free market economy and its workings, you're just applying those models to a situation to which they do not apply. Now, to understand why things happened as they did during the war, you have to recognize it's a command economy. It's a war fascist economy. It's something different. And so how it works is not going to be determined by the usual economic forces that will determine how a free market economy will work. So look, for example, at what went on in those labor markets I mentioned. Here I've got some data about employment and unemployment. These are shown for fiscal years, government fiscal year. In those days, ended at the end of June each year. So fiscal 1940 was the 12 months ending on June 30th, 1940. Later on, in the 1970s, the fiscal year was moved 3 months ahead. But anyhow, these are the years we're looking at here, government fiscal years. Now, if you look at 1940, you can see what I mentioned, that the Depression was not over. The civilian unemployment rate is almost 16% in fiscal 1940. Now, some of those people who were counted by the Bureau of Labor Statistics as unemployed then, and during the war for that matter, actually had jobs. But the way the BLS collected data on unemployment, it thought that it was wrong to count people as unemployed when they were working in what was called emergency employment programs, which the government had set up in the early 1930s, especially in 1933 and years later, to some extent even before that. Okay? Well, they didn't count those people in 1940 who were working in Works Progress Administration jobs, construction jobs for projects the government undertook around the country, building post offices and putting sidewalks in cities and sewer systems, and you name it. They built all kinds of stuff. Airports for small towns, sometimes not so small towns, and so forth. So if you took away from the unemployment rate, the 3 million or so people who were actually working in emergency employment jobs, the unemployment rate would be not nearly 16%, but more like 10 or so. So that's high unemployment, okay? Even if you get rid of this curiosity about how to count people who are working in so-called emergency employment programs. But what happens to it later? It falls drastically as the economy starts to be mobilized for war in 1941. Unemployment starts to fall, and then during the strict war years of 42 through 45, it reaches extraordinarily low levels. The lowest, just over 1%. Those, by the way, are by far the lowest recorded unemployment unemployment rates in all American history. The normal unemployment rate before World War II was in the neighborhood of 5%. And that included, all kinds of people who were not in a job at the moment, some between jobs, some had been laid off, some had quit, and so forth. It's just the kind of normal ebb and flow that we see in any free labor market. There's never going to be zero unemployment. It's just not in the nature of a decentralized system. So normal would have been 5%. Even after a decade of depression, we got at least twice that in 1940. But it falls very rapidly and gets down to these amazingly low levels during the war. As I say, you want a job, you got a job. And it hardly mattered where you lived in the country, what your job experience was, what your training was, you name it. You could get a job. And particularly if it was a job that had anything to do with supplying the military, what were called war plants, which didn't have to be making guns or tanks or battleships. It could be making steel or copper or aluminum or a lot of other things that was heavily channeled into war at that time. You could still be hired, trained, put in a job, paid very well. These war workers earned about 40% more than people in comparable non-war employments during the war. So this seemed like a very good deal to people at the time. Now, many of the people at the time, however, were not in a position to take these jobs. And the reason is shown in part here in this column, defense employment. Defense employment. That includes two kinds of